was just trying to order a beer. That's all. Frank Morrison, 78 years old, shuffled up to Murphy's bar on a Tuesday evening, his worn dog tags catching the dim light as they swayed against his faded flannel shirt. The place was packed with younger patrons, their laughter echoing off the walls, their phones glowing as they captured every moment of their lives. But Frank just wanted one quiet drink before heading home to his empty apartment. The bartender, a cocky 20-something named Derek with sleeve tattoos and an attitude that screamed entitlement, looked up from his phone with visible annoyance. His eyes immediately locked onto the dog tags, and a smirk spread across his face like poison. "Let me guess, old man. You're gonna tell me some war story and expect a free drink?" Frank's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet. Not from fear, not from anger, from the weight of memories that Derek couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Just a beer, son, whatever you have on tap." But Derek wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting started. He leaned across the bar, his voice loud enough for the entire establishment to hear. "Those dog tags real, Grandpa? Or did you pick them up at a thrift store to get attention?" The laughter that erupted from nearby tables was like daggers, sharp, cruel, completely oblivious. Frank's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Not here. Not with children who had never seen real combat, never held a dying friend, never made the kind of sacrifices that haunt your dreams for decades. He simply placed a $20 bill on the bar and waited. $20 for a beer? Derek laughed, shaking his head. "What do you think this is? The VFW Hall? This is a real bar for real people, not some wannabe hero looking for handouts." He poured the cheapest beer they had, letting the foam overflow deliberately, creating a mess that he made no effort to clean. "There you go, soldier boy. Enjoy your beer and your stolen valor." The words hit Frank like physical blows. Stolen valor. If this punk only knew what those tags represented. If he only understood the price paid for the freedom he so carelessly enjoyed. But Frank just picked up his beer, foam dripping down the sides, and found a corner table where he could drink in peace. The bar patrons had already moved on to other entertainment. Their attention spans, Frank noticed, were about as short as their memories when it came to honoring those who served. He sipped his beer slowly, each drop tasting bitter not from the alcohol, but from the humiliation that burned in his chest like shrapnel. That's when the television above the bar flickered to a breaking news report. The volume was low, but Frank could see the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Something about declassified military operations. Something about heroes finally being recognized. But Derek and his customers were too busy with their phones and their gossip to notice. Those weren't just any dog tags hanging around Frank Morrison's neck. And Derek was about to learn exactly what stolen valor really looked like. If you believe that respect should never retire with age, and that some stories deserve to be heard before they're lost forever, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Because what happened next would change everything Derek thought he knew about heroism. Frank Morrison had been coming to Murphy's bar for exactly 3 months. Not because he enjoyed the atmosphere, certainly not because he appreciated the service, but because it was the closest establishment to the VA hospital where he received his weekly treatments. Chemotherapy, they called it. A battle against an enemy that had been growing inside him for years, silent and deadly, just like some of VO. The missions he'd once undertaken for his country. He never talked about those missions. Never bragged about his service. Never wore his Purple Heart or Bronze Star or any of the other decorations that collected dust in a shoebox under his bed. Frank Morrison was from a generation that believed actions spoke louder than words, and that true heroes didn't need recognition to sleep at night. But sleep didn't come easy for Frank. It hadn't for over 50 years. Not since that classified operation in Southeast Asia that officially never happened. Not since he'd volunteered for a mission so dangerous, so sensitive that the government sealed the records and swore everyone involved to secrecy. Some secrets, they told him, were more important than recognition. Some sacrifices had to remain hidden for the greater good, so Frank kept quiet. He worked his 40 years at the steel mill, raised his daughter after his wife passed, and never once complained about the nightmares or the pain in his joints from old injuries that couldn't be explained without revealing state secrets. He was a ghost of American military history, a man whose heroism was buried in classified files that might never see the light of day. The chemotherapy wasn't working as well as the doctors had hoped. Frank knew his time was running short. Maybe that's why Derek's words had stung more than usual. When you're facing your final months, being called a fraud by someone who had never sacrificed anything more meaningful than a weekend felt particularly cruel. But here's what Derek and everyone else in that bar didn't understand about men like Frank Morrison. They didn't wear their service like a costume. They didn't demand special treatment or free drinks or constant validation. They simply carried their dignity quietly, like those dog tags against their chest, and hoped that somehow their sacrifices had made the world a little bit safer for the next generation. Even for ungrateful punks like Derek who mocked what they couldn't comprehend. Do you know what real heroism looks like? It's not always loud. It's not always recognized. Sometimes it's an old man sitting alone in a corner, sipping overpriced beer while 20-somethings laugh at his expense, never once complaining about the secret he's carried for 5 decades. The news report on the television was getting more detailed now. Frank could see grainy footage of helicopters and jungle terrain. His heart began to race, not from the excitement of potential recognition, but from the familiar anxiety that always accompanied memories of that place, that time, that mission that changed everything. Meanwhile, Derek continued his performance. For the crowd, occasionally glancing over at Frank with theatrical disgust. "Look at him over there," he whispered loudly to a group of college kids. "Probably bought those tags online. You know how these old-timers are, living in fantasies about wars they never fought." The college kids laughed dutifully, but one of them, a young woman with kind eyes, looked uncomfortable. She'd noticed something Derek had missed. The way Frank held himself. The way his eyes scanned the room, always alert, always watchful. The way he positioned himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of all exits. These weren't the mannerisms of a man playing dress-up. These were the automatic behaviors of someone who had been trained to survive in hostile territory. But Derek was too busy performing to notice such details. He was playing to his audience, feeding off their laughter like a parasite feeding off a host. And Frank Morrison just sat there taking it all, because he'd learned long ago that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is remain silent while smaller men reveal their true character. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. He'd once risked everything to protect the freedoms that allowed Derek to mock him publicly. He'd volunteered for missions that could have gotten him killed or captured, faced torture or execution, all so that future generations could live in safety and express themselves freely, even if they chose to use that freedom to humiliate the very people who had secured it for them. Subscribe to our channel if you believe that true strength isn't measured by the volume of your voice, but by the weight of your character. Because Frank Morrison was about to become the most famous man in America, and Derek was about to learn a lesson in humility that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The breaking news report was getting longer now, and more detailed. The anchor was talking about recently declassified documents from the Vietnam era, something about a top-secret rescue mission that had saved dozens of American prisoners of war, something about volunteers who had penetrated deep behind enemy lines with no official support and no guarantee of extraction. Frank's beer trembled in his hands as fragments of that night came flooding back. The humidity, the mosquitoes, the whispered communications, the impossible odds, the friends who didn't make it home. The woman at the college table was watching the television now, her attention split between the news report and the old man in the corner. She was studying journalism, and she'd developed an eye for details that others missed. Something about this story felt connected to something else. Something about the old man with the dog tags who sat so quietly while the bartender mocked him. Derek, meanwhile, was reaching new heights of cruelty. He'd started a game with some of the other patrons, making up fake military stories and attributing them to Frank. "I bet he'll tell you he single-handedly won Vietnam," Derek announced to anyone who would listen. These wannabes always claim they were special forces or some nonsense. Frank closed his eyes and tried to push down the memories that were surfacing despite his best efforts. He could hear the helicopters again, feel the weight of his equipment. smell the jungle and the fear and the determination that had carried him through impossible circumstances. He could see the faces of the men they'd rescued, men who had been given up for dead, men who got to go home to their families because Frank and 11 other volunteers had decided that no American would be left behind. 11 other volunteers. Frank was the only one still alive. The television volume suddenly increased as someone adjusted it with the remote. The anchor's voice filled the bar, cutting through the laughter and conversation like a knife through silk. The mission, codenamed Operation Silent Valor, has remained classified for over 50 years due to its sensitive nature and the ongoing protection of surviving personnel. Silent Valor. Frank's blood turned to ice. After all these years, they were finally talking about it, finally acknowledging what had happened in that jungle hell half a century ago. But why now? Why, when he was dying and alone and being mocked by children who couldn't comprehend sacrifice? The journalism student was on her feet now, her phone out, recording the news report. She'd noticed Frank's reaction to the story, the way his entire body had gone rigid when the operation name was mentioned. Professional instinct kicked in, and she began connecting dots that others were too distracted to see. Here's the thing about hidden heroes. They're hidden until they're not. And when the truth finally comes to light, it illuminates not just their courage, but the ignorance of those who doubted them. Derek was about to discover that stolen valor has a very specific definition, and it doesn't apply to men who actually earned the right to wear those tags. It applies to people who mock genuine heroes while hiding behind their own cowardice and insecurity. The news report continued with more details about Operation Silent Valor. 12 volunteers had penetrated 60 miles behind enemy lines to rescue American POWs who had been missing for over 2 years. The mission had been so dangerous, so politically sensitive, that the government had officially denied its existence for decades. The volunteers had been sworn to secrecy, their actions buried in classified files, their heroism hidden from a grateful nation that never even knew their names. Frank Morrison's name was about to be spoken on national television for the first time in 50 years. And Derek was about to learn what real heroism looked like. The anchor's voice grew more solemn as he continued reading from the declassified documents. Among the volunteers for Operation Silent Valor was Staff Sergeant Franklin Morrison of Detroit, Michigan. Morrison, then 26 years old, was selected for his expertise in jungle warfare and his psychological profile that indicated unusual courage under extreme stress. The journalism student's phone was recording everything now. She looked from the television to Frank, then back to the television, her eyes widening as she realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. An old man being mocked for wearing dog tags that he'd earned through acts of heroism that had been classified for half a century. Derek hadn't noticed the change in the news report yet. He was too busy entertaining his audience, too caught up in his performance to pay attention to anything that didn't directly feed his ego. He'd moved on to making jokes about Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars, completely unaware that the man he was mocking had earned both of those decorations and several others that weren't even mentioned in his official service record. Frank's hands were shaking more violently now as the memories came flooding back in vivid detail. The briefing room where they'd volunteered for a mission with a 70% casualty projection. The helicopter insertion under cover of darkness. The 20-mile march through hostile territory while carrying equipment that weighed more than some people. The moment they'd found the prison camp and realized that 3 of the American POWs were already dead from torture and neglect. The rage that had filled him when he saw what had been done to his fellow Americans. The cold calculation with which he and his team had eliminated the enemy guards. The desperate evacuation under fire, carrying wounded prisoners who could barely walk. The helicopter extraction that had turned into a running gunfight as enemy forces converged on their position. Frank had been shot twice during that extraction. Once in the shoulder, once in the leg. He'd kept fighting until every American was safely aboard the helicopter, then collapsed from blood loss. The medals they'd given him later had been presented in a classified ceremony with no family present, no photographs taken, no records kept beyond the classified files that were sealed. Immediately afterward, the news report was showing old footage now. Grainy black and white images of helicopters and jungle terrain. Maps with classified markings that had been partially redacted even in the declassified version. And then, incredibly, a photograph that Frank hadn't seen in 50 years. It was his team. 12 young men in jungle fatigues, faces painted with camouflage, weapons at the ready. They looked impossibly young, impossibly confident, impossibly brave. Frank could name every man in that photograph. He could tell you about their families, their dreams, their fears. He could tell you exactly how each of the 11 who didn't make it home had died. The journalism student was moving closer to Frank's table now, her phone still recording, her journalistic instincts screaming that she was in the presence of living history. She could see the recognition in his eyes as he looked at the television. She could see the pain and the pride and the weight of memories that had been carried in silence for 5 decades. Derek finally noticed that the bar had gotten quieter. People were paying attention to the television instead of his comedy routine. This annoyed him immensely, as it always did when he wasn't the center of attention. He glanced at the screen dismissively, ready to make another joke about fake war stories, when he saw the photograph of the 12 soldiers. The soldier standing, third from the left, looked remarkably familiar. Younger, yes, 50 years younger. But the eyes were the same. The stance was the same. The quiet dignity that Derek had been mocking all evening was written clearly across the face of Staff Sergeant Franklin Morrison, volunteer for Operation Silent Valor, holder of the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Silver Star, genuine American hero. Derek's face went pale as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked from the television to Frank, then back to the television, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The man he'd been calling a fraud, a wannabe, a thrift store soldier, was sitting right there in his bar, a living piece of American military history. A man whose actions had saved lives and whose sacrifice had been hidden from public recognition for half a century. The journalism student approached Frank's table with the reverence usually reserved for meeting presidents or movie stars. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "Are you Staff Sergeant Morrison?" Frank looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much and carried too many secrets for too long. After 50 years of silence, the words came out like a whisper. "I was. Long time ago. But here's what happened next, that truly revealed the character of everyone involved." The journalism student didn't ask for selfies or autographs. She didn't try to interview him or exploit his story for her own gain. Instead, she walked over to Derek behind the bar and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "That man you've been mocking all evening. He's a genuine American hero. He risked his life to save prisoners of war in a classified mission that's just now being declassified. Maybe you should apologize." Derek stood there speechless, his face burning with shame, as the entire bar turned to look at Frank Morrison with new eyes. The man they'd ignored, the veteran they'd dismissed, the old-timer they'd laughed at, was suddenly revealed as something much more significant than any of them had imagined. And Frank just finished his beer, left a tip on the table despite everything that had happened, and prepared to walk home to his empty apartment, where he would continue his quiet battle with cancer, just as he'd quietly carried the secrets of his service for 50 years. Some heroes don't need recognition to be heroic, but sometimes recognition finds them anyway. The news report continued for another 20 minutes, detailing the incredible courage of the Operation Silent Valor volunteers, and revealing that 8 of the 12 team members had been killed in action during subsequent classified missions. The report mentioned that only 4 members of the original team were still alive, and that the government was finally acknowledging their service as part of a broader initiative to honor previously classified heroic actions. Frank Morrison's name was mentioned 6 times during the broadcast. Each mention felt surreal to him, like hearing about someone else's life. For 50 years, he'd been legally prohibited from discussing the most meaningful experience of his military career. For 50 years, he'd carried the weight of those memories alone, unable to share them with his wife, his daughter, or anyone else who might have helped him process the trauma and the pride that came with surviving such an experience. The journalism student, whose name was Sarah Chen, had been quietly recording the entire evening on her phone. Not to exploit or embarrass anyone, but because her instincts told her she was witnessing something historically significant. When the news report ended, she approached Derek behind the bar with the calm confidence of someone who understood exactly what had just transpired. "His name is Franklin Morrison," she said, her voice carrying an authority that her 21 years shouldn't have possessed. "He's 78 years old. He's receiving treatment at the VA hospital for cancer, and he's one of 4 surviving members of the most classified rescue mission in American military history. Every Tuesday for the past 3 months, he's come here for exactly 1 beer before going home to an empty apartment where he fights his illness alone." Derek's hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the bar. The full weight of his behavior was crashing down on him like an avalanche. He'd spent the evening humiliating a man who had volunteered for a mission with a 70% death rate. He'd mocked someone who had been shot twice while saving American prisoners of war. He'd called a genuine hero a fraud while performing, for an audience that had laughed at the expense of someone infinitely braver than any of them. "I didn't know," Derek whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Because the truth was, he hadn't wanted to know. He'd made assumptions based on prejudice and ignorance, choosing mockery over curiosity, cruelty over kindness. Sarah pulled up the news footage on her phone and showed it to the other patrons in the bar. The photograph of the 12 young soldiers became the centerpiece of a conversation that transformed the entire atmosphere of the establishment. People who had been laughing at Frank Morrison an hour earlier were now looking at him with a mixture of awe and shame. But Frank himself seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. He'd spent 5 decades learning to live without recognition, and sudden fame felt foreign and unwelcome. When Sarah approached his table to ask if he'd like to share his story, he shook his head gently. "Some stories belong to the dead," he said, quietly. "I was just lucky enough to come home." This response only increased the respect that everyone in the bar was beginning to feel for him. Here was a man who had every right to demand acknowledgement, every justification for anger at how he'd been treated, every reason to capitalize on his newfound recognition. Instead, he displayed the same quiet dignity that had carried him through 50 years of silence. Derek approached Frank's table with all the humility that had been absent from his earlier performance. His face was red with shame, his voice barely audible as he spoke. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I was completely, totally wrong, and I'm sorry." Frank looked up at the young man who had spent the evening making his life miserable. He saw fear in Derek's eyes, and shame, and something that might have been genuine remorse. For a moment, the old soldier studied the face of his tormentor, weighing decades of experience against the honest regret he saw there. "You're young," Frank said finally. "Young people make stupid mistakes. The question is what you learn from them." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was the response of a man who had seen enough real evil in his lifetime to distinguish between cruelty born of ignorance and cruelty born of genuine malice. Derek had been stupid and insensitive, but he wasn't irredeemable. The conversation in the bar continued late into the evening as people processed what they had learned. Sarah Chen had stopped recording, but she hadn't stopped asking questions. Not intrusive questions about classified missions or personal trauma, but thoughtful questions about the experience of carrying secrets and the challenge of transitioning from military to civilian life. Frank found himself talking more than he had in months, not about the classified details of Operation Silent Valor, but about the broader experience of service and sacrifice, about the friends he'd lost and the responsibility he felt to honor their memory, about the difficulty of growing old while carrying the ghosts of young men who never got the chance to age. Other patrons joined the conversation gradually. It turned out that several of them had veterans in their families. Stories were shared about grandfathers who had served in World War II, fathers who had fought in Korea, brothers who had deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. The evening transformed from a scene of mockery and humiliation into something approaching a community discussion about service and sacrifice. Derek found himself learning more about military history in 3 hours than he had in his entire lifetime. He learned about the difference between classified and unclassified operations. He learned about the psychological cost of combat and the challenges faced by veterans seeking medical care. He learned about the generation gap between those who had served in unpopular wars and those who had grown up during peacetime. Most importantly, he learned about the danger of making assumptions about people based on their appearance or age. Frank Morrison looked like any other elderly man struggling with illness. Nothing about his appearance suggested that he had once been among the most elite soldiers in the American military. Nothing indicated that he had volunteered for missions that regular infantry units couldn't handle. But then again, real heroes rarely look like the Hollywood version of heroism. They look like ordinary people who did extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. They look like old men drinking beer alone in corner booths, carrying their dignity quietly, while lesser men mock what they don't understand. By the time Frank left Murphy's bar that night, the entire atmosphere had changed permanently. Word spread quickly through the community about what had happened, about the veteran who had been revealed as a hero, about the bartender who had learned a lesson in humility, about the journalism student who had recognized something special and handled it with appropriate respect. Within a week, Frank Morrison had received calls from 3 different news organizations wanting to interview him. The Department of Defense had reached out to invite him to a ceremony honoring the declassified Operation Silent Valor veterans. The local VFW post had offered him free membership and asked if he'd consider speaking at their monthly meetings. Franco declined most of these opportunities. He wasn't interested in celebrity or exploitation of his service, but he did agree to speak at the VFW, and he did attend the Pentagon ceremony where he was reunited with the 3 other surviving members of his team. For the first time in 50 years, he was able to talk openly about the mission that had defined his military career and haunted his dreams. Derek, meanwhile, had undergone his own transformation. He'd used his own money to frame the news article about Operation Silent Valor and hang it prominently behind the bar. He'd established a policy of free drinks for any veteran who could show military identification. He'd started volunteering at the local VA hospital, helping with recreational activities for patients receiving long-term care. Sarah Chen had written an article about the evening for her college newspaper, focusing not on the classified details of Frank's mission, but on the broader themes of hidden heroism and the importance of respecting elderly veterans. The article had been picked up by several national publications and had sparked conversations about how society treats its aging military heroes. Murphy's Bar became something of a local landmark after the story spread. People came specifically hoping to meet Frank Morrison, to hear his story, to be in the presence of living history. Frank found this attention overwhelming and eventually stopped coming to the bar, preferring to receive his treatments at the VA and spend his remaining time in the quiet privacy of his apartment. But the impact of that evening continued to ripple outward through the community. Other veterans who had been hesitant to share their stories found themselves more willing to talk about their experiences. Younger people developed a greater appreciation for the sacrifices made by previous generations. The conversation about military service and civilian recognition became more nuanced and respectful. Derek never forgot the lesson he learned that night. Years later, when he eventually owned his own restaurant, he would tell the story to employees who seemed to be developing attitudes of superiority toward older customers. He would show them the framed article about Operation Silent Valor and explain how assumptions and prejudice had nearly caused him to miss the opportunity to meet one of America's genuine heroes. Frank Morrison passed away 8 months after that evening at Murphy's Bar. His cancer had progressed despite treatment, and he died peacefully in his sleep at the VA hospital. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including the 3 other surviving members of Operation Silent Valor, military officials from the Pentagon, and dozens of community members who had been touched by his story. Derek served as one of the pallbearers, an honor that Frank's daughter had specifically requested after learning about how her father's revelation had transformed the young man's life. Sarah Chen spoke at the service about the importance of recognizing heroism in all its forms, especially the quiet heroism of those who serve without seeking recognition. The dog tags that had been mocked on that Tuesday evening in Murphy's Bar were buried with Frank Morrison, along with the medals he had earned but rarely displayed. But the story of that evening lived on, told and retold as an example of how quickly perception can change when truth is revealed. and how much we can learn when we choose curiosity over judgment. Here's the thing about real heroes. They don't need your recognition to be heroic. But when you take the time to recognize them, when you choose respect over mockery, when you listen instead of assume, you might discover that the most extraordinary people often look exactly like ordinary ones. You might learn that the old man, drinking alone in the corner, has stories that would humble your pride and courage, that would shame your complaints. Frank Morrison never needed Derek's apology to validate his service. He never needed the community's recognition to know his worth. He never needed the news report to understand the significance of what he and his team had accomplished in that jungle 50 years ago. But Derek needed to give that apology. The community needed to offer that recognition. And maybe we all need to remember that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and parades. Sometimes it sits quietly in corner booths, wearing dog tags that represent sacrifices too classified to discuss, carrying memories too heavy to share, and displaying dignity too profound for shallow minds to comprehend. If this story made you think differently about the elderly veterans in your community, take a moment to leave a comment about someone who served that you'd like to honor. Because the Frank Morrisons of the world are leaving us every day, taking their stories and their sacrifices with them, and once they're gone, we can never thank them for the freedoms we take for granted.